Good morning, and welcome to the morning. I'm so glad you're here. Today is Saturday, June 20th, 2026. There is a lot going on in the world this week: geopolitics, a messy pool, a dog that deserved better, and a city that remembered how to talk to strangers. Let's get into it. We're going to start where New York City's heart is right now, and honestly, where a lot of people's hearts are, even if they've never set foot on the island of Manhattan. The New York Knicks are NBA champions. For the first time in 53 years. 53 years. To put that in perspective, the last time the Knicks won a title, Richard Nixon was in the White House, the Vietnam War was still being fought, and the World Trade Center towers hadn't even been completed yet. Generations of New York basketball fans lived and died without ever seeing their team hold that trophy. And now, it has happened. The scenes from New York City after the final buzzer sounded are something to behold. Matt Flegenheimer, writing for The Times, described the celebration this way, and I want to share some of his words because they really capture it. He called it giggling, weeping, spinning, convulsing, mosh pitting, truck honking, law skirting, trumpet playing, cowbell ringing, off-key singing, cigar lighting, all-night A&G. People hugging strangers so hard they went airborne. Fist-bumping cabbies through gridlocked traffic. Climbing stoplights and trees and scaffolding just to wave the team flag higher. Someone spotted utility cones in the streets and started wearing them as hats because they're orange. There were tears on the sidewalk outside Madison Square Garden. Kick lines in a Broadway bike lane to Sinatra. Start spreading the news. A man standing on a bus stop bench making announcements to no one and everyone: "Ladies and gentlemen, we have just witnessed Historiae." And the whole block calling back with everything they had. Flegenheimer writes that this championship felt different from celebrations in other cities, and he makes a compelling case for why. Basketball is New York's game. The city has jangling metal backboards in its parks and Rucker Park in its DNA. It's a close-quarters sport for a close-quarters city. And this team, Jalen Brunson, OG Anunoby, Karl Anthony Towns, known affectionately as Bodega Katie, seem to understand that. "We reflect all our fans and their lifestyles," Towns said during the series, "and what it takes to make it in New York City." Brunson is worth dwelling on for a moment. He's the team's best player, small by NBA standards, passed over and underestimated by his previous team, but raised by his father, a former Knick, to know that winning in New York would mean more than winning anywhere else. And OG Anunoby, his game-winning, sideways-flying, logic-defying tip-in during Game 4 was the kind of play that looked like it was already being bronzed into a statue midair. The rallying cry all playoffs was Knicks in 4. Said with total confidence, even after they lost Game 3? Then Knicks in 5. And finally, with the accuracy of fact rather than aspiration, across the boroughs early Sunday morning. Bill Bradley, a Hall of Famer from the last championship team in 1973, was watching from a chair at a watch party when the Knicks won Game 1. He said, "It's pure, there it is. The ball either goes in or it doesn't. There is no ambiguity and no doubt about what has just happened." Flegenheimer makes one more point that resonates deeply. New York's shared experiences tend to be rooted in tragedy. 9/11. Sandy. COVID. What made this championship run feel so disorienting, in the best possible way, was that the shared experience was allowed to be, in his words, good, gleeful, uncomplicated. And there's another layer to this story, a more human layer, that the morning's Saturday writer Melissa Kirsch explores in today's main essay. Because beyond the basketball, beyond the championship, what the Knicks did to New York City is something more remarkable. They made strangers talk to each other. New York is famous for what the sociologist Irving Goffman called civil inattention, that practiced art of acknowledging people with a respectful glance that never actually engages. Eyes forward. Headphones in. Mind your business. It's not rudeness, New Yorkers will tell you. It's a modus vivendi. A survival strategy for a city of 8 million people living on top of each other. But since the NBA Finals began, and with particular intensity since the championship was won, that armor has been dissolving. A blue and orange hat is now a license to start a conversation with a complete stranger in line at the deli. You can nod at the old man in the Knicks Forever tee and neon sneakers, and he nods back. You can ask the person next to you in the elevator if they saw the game. Kish writes about what the anthropologist Victor Turner called communitas, that feeling of ecstatic kinship that emerges when the usual social scripts are set aside, when the normal structure of society gives way to what he described as warm human kindness. It's precious partly because it's temporary. Turner actually cautioned against trying to make communitis permanent. He believed the return to normal social structure was essential for a functioning society. People, he said, return to structure revitalized by their experience of communitis. But there's something to hold on to. Now that New Yorkers and people watching from everywhere have admitted they want to connect with each other, that it feels good to chat and high-five and smile at people they don't know, what comes next? The new season tips off in October. Now, we're going to shift gears significantly. From the pure joy of New York to the complicated, precarious state of diplomacy in the Middle East and its very real consequences for global shipping, energy markets, and millions of people's daily lives. This week brought a preliminary agreement between the United States and Iran, a deal signed by President Trump and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian that begins a 60-day period of negotiations. The key headline from the deal: Iran promised to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, and the U.S. military lifted the blockade it had imposed on Iranian ships since April. To understand why this matters, a quick geography reminder. The Strait of Hormuz is the narrow passage connecting the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea. About 20% of the world's oil travels through it. When it gets blocked, or even when there's significant uncertainty about whether ships can pass safely, the ripple effects move through global energy markets almost immediately. Since the start of the conflict, roughly 500 commercial vessels have been stranded in the Persian Gulf. 11,000 seafarers have been stuck on those ships. And on Friday, things that seemed like they might be resolving started complicating again. The next round of US-Iran talks, which were supposed to be held in Switzerland, was postponed. Israel said it had targeted Hezbollah militants in Lebanon after 4 of its soldiers were killed. Israel later committed to a new ceasefire, but its ambassador made clear that Israeli troops would remain in southern Lebanon, leaving open the question of what happens next. A news agency linked to Iran's Revolutionary Guards published an editorial calling for the strait to be closed again. Oil prices, which had fallen sharply following the initial deal announcement, started rising again. For the shipping companies trying to figure out if they could finally move their stranded vessels, the picture remained deeply uncertain. The strait has naval mines in its central section. GPS and satellite navigation systems have been subject to interference. There are 2 routes in and out, a northern one through Iranian waters, and a southern one through Omani waters, which the U.S. Navy has been supervising but where ships risk running aground on rocks. And then on Friday, Iran's newly formed Persian Gulf Strait Authority, an agency Iran created to regulate traffic through the strait, issued a notice saying all vessels would need a permit and an approved insurer to transit, and that passage would only be permitted through the Iranian route near Larak Island. Any deviation would be viewed as a violation. This raised immediate questions about international sanctions. Could shipowners even engage with Iranian authorities to get those insurance policies without violating U.S. or European sanctions? The head of marine insurance at the Lloyd's Market Association said simply, "There isn't really clarity over that one." The U.S. Central Command pushed back, saying all vessels have the right to pass through the strait without any arbitrary requirement claims or impediments, and that U.S. forces would continue operating in the area to support freedom of navigation. Meanwhile, Hapag-Lloyd, the German shipping company with 4 vessels and roughly 90 seafarers stuck in the Gulf, said its ships were ready to go but staying put for now. "No indication right now when we would move," their spokesman said. And adding a bit of the grimly mundane to the geopolitical drama, after sitting still in the Persian Gulf for more than 3 months, barnacles and sea creatures have grown on the hulls of stranded ships, slowing them down and creating operational headaches. On top of all this, Iran's supreme leader weighed in publicly for the first time. Ayatollah Mujtaba Khamenei issued a statement saying he had authorized the deal but that he did not agree with signing it as a matter of principle. He didn't elaborate on what that means in practice, but the message was clear: he is distancing himself from it, placing responsibility squarely on President Pezeshkian, and signaling that Iran's negotiators have very limited room to grant concessions to, in his words, the enemy. It is obvious that the in-person negotiations that will take place in the future do not mean accepting the enemy's view, Khamenei wrote. He also praised Iran's diplomats while denigrating President Trump, saying Trump came to the agreement out of desperation. Iran's parliament speaker, who has been leading negotiations, responded with a statement of his own thanking Khamenei and making sure the supreme leader knew where he stood. "If the enemy seeks excessive demands along this path, we have already proven that our hand remains on the trigger, and we have no hesitation in delivering a crushing response." This is the diplomatic backdrop into which 60 days of negotiations are supposed to unfold. It is, to put it mildly, complicated. One country is watching all of this with particular urgency, and that's India. The Times reports that India had, as of Wednesday, just 9 to 10 days of oil reserves remaining. Japan and South Korea, also heavily dependent on Persian Gulf imports, each held roughly 200 days of reserves. India had 9. India's Prime Minister Modi has already warned of hard times ahead, raised fuel prices, and tightened restrictions on overseas spending. Shortages of cooking gas reached households immediately. Parts of India's industrial base started shutting down. Iran was once one of India's most important energy suppliers. As recently as 2009, Iranian oil made up 14% of India's crude imports, making it India's second largest supplier. Then American sanctions pushed India to sever that relationship entirely by 2019. Now, with the possibility of Iranian oil coming back online, India is uniquely positioned. The world's largest oil refinery belongs to India's Reliance Industries and sits directly across the Arabian Sea from the Strait of Hormuz. Oil tankers from the Gulf can complete a round trip to India in less time than it takes to make a one-way voyage to ports on China's Pacific coast. India's refiners can also handle a wide variety of crude grades, giving them unusual flexibility. But there's caution too. India has been burned repeatedly by shifting American policy on who it can buy oil from. Russia, Iran, Venezuela, the rules have changed again and again, often midstream. There have been so many changes, you hardly know what to expect from the US now, said one former executive at India's largest state-owned oil company. India is also watching carefully to see whether the terms of the deal allow it to revive stalled investments in an Iranian port that was supposed to give India access to Central Asia without routing through Pakistan. The answer to that question is not yet clear. All right. From geopolitics to the bizarre, and specifically to the Lincoln Memorial reflecting pool, which is apparently rejecting its makeover. You may remember that President Trump ordered the century-old reflecting pool, the one that stretches between the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial, to be repainted American flag blue in time for the country's 250th birthday. The work was finished about 2 weeks ago, using a no-bid contract awarded to a firm that Trump said he recommended because it had previously worked on the swimming pools at one of his golf clubs. Since then, it has been nothing but headaches. First, the new paint job looked uneven. Then, an algae bloom turned the water acid green. This week, the Interior Department declared on social media that workers had killed the algae and the water was now crystal clear, with photos of a blue, reflective pool. But when Times reporter Aishvarya Kavi actually went to the pool on Friday afternoon, the water was murky and stained by loose clumps of algae that workers had only partially scrubbed away. And chunks of the American flag blue coating were peeling off the basin, one gap about the size of a park bench, with a sheet of the coating several inches long flapping in the waves. One visitor, Alex Hobe, pulled a chip of the coating out of the water. It was semi-transparent and rough to the touch. He called the renovation a complete failure, while also expressing sympathy for the 10 workers standing knee-deep in green water scrubbing in the hot sun. The underlying problem, engineers say, is that the pool has leaky and broken pipes that frequently disconnect it from its filtration system, and those problems were not addressed by the recent renovations. Workers have been adding hydrogen peroxide to the water to kill algae, and sightseers this week were stepping over pipes carrying acid green water from the pool to nearby storm drains. On Friday night, President Trump blamed some of the problems on vandalism by people he said were out to destroy and demean our beautiful work. He said the algae was 75% gone and conditions would soon be remedied. For many visitors, though, the murky pool itself had become the attraction. "I don't even know what they're doing," one woman exclaimed as she walked toward the Lincoln Memorial. Another visitor said he had seen the pool many times before the renovation and thought it looked great and had never thought twice about its appearance. "I thought it looked great," he said. "And it took me back to watching Forrest Gump." Now let's talk about the Pentagon, and a story from Times reporters Greg Jaffe and Kate Kelly that is going to be with us for a while. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has blocked the promotions of at least 40 senior military officers to general and admiral ranks this year. About half of those blocked officers are women or members of minority groups. The Times reports this isn't a coincidence. Here's how the process has worked. By law, 1-star and 2-star officers are chosen through promotion selection boards made up of senior military officers, a confidential process run by the individual service branches. Last year, Hegseth ordered the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps to do online searches of officers selected by those boards, looking for photos, videos, or news articles that might draw the secretary's ire. The material was internally referred to as DROG, short for derogatory. Hegseth then began pulling officers from the lists. Officers who had spoken publicly about diversity in the ranks. Officers who had strongly urged their troops to get COVID vaccines. Officers who commanded aircraft carriers where public affairs sailors had documented their commanders participating in any diversity-related events. Those photos and videos, posted on official Navy websites, were now being used against them. The Times tells the story of one black officer, Rear Admiral Stephen Barnett, whose blocked promotion shocked senior Navy officials. Barnett had more experience than any other candidate for the command that oversees the Navy's bases at home and abroad. He had successfully managed the aftermath of one of the Navy's worst environmental disasters, a fuel spill that contaminated an aquifer in Hawaii, sickening thousands. His work there lasted more than 3 years, and Senator Mazie Hirono of Hawaii called him an important and trusted partner, proactive, communicative and professional. The Navy's top civilian and uniformed leaders both chose Barnett. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs agreed. Then the decision fell to Hegseth, who pulled his name from the list. Why? Because years earlier, Barnett had spoken at a Black History Month event and talked about diversity in the military. He had appeared at a Pride Month event. His remarks were in line with Pentagon policy at the time. An internal Navy review concluded that his digital footprint was remarkably disciplined and issue-focused and that the only potential signals were those of empathy and inclusivity. Hegseth selected a white officer who was the Navy's third choice for the job. The Times reports Hegseth has also blocked promotions through the 3- and 4-star ranks, where there are no formal selection boards. Among those affected, Vice Admiral Sarah Joyner, a 3-star fighter pilot who had appeared in a Navy recruiting ad about her trailblazing career as the first woman to command a carrier air wing. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs personally asked Hegseth to reconsider. He refused. Joyner retired last fall. Hegseth has so far declined to give Congress the names of officers he has removed from promotion lists. A Senate bill would require written justification when an officer is pulled. In another significant development on the policy front, the Trump administration announced Friday it is beginning to phase out AIDS funding for South Africa, specifically its participation in PEPFAR, the president's emergency plan for AIDS relief. PEPFAR has been one of the most consequential American foreign policy programs of the past 2 decades, funding HIV prevention and treatment across Africa. South Africa is being removed, according to the State Department, because it has failed to make demonstrable progress on policy requests by the administration. What policy requests? The administration has called on South Africa to repeal a land expropriation law, to exempt American companies from black empowerment policies, and to not align with U.S. adversaries like Iran. These demands have nothing to do with how PEPFAR operates. South Africa has the highest HIV prevalence in the world, approximately 8 million people living with the virus. The country received roughly $456 million in U.S. HIV and AIDS funding in 2024. By 2025, after USAID was dismantled, that had already dropped to $213 million. The program currently supports more than 15,000 healthcare workers in South Africa. The South African government said it has been preparing for this possibility since the USAID cuts last year and is working on a plan to fund its HIV program with its own money. The country does not rely on PEPFAR for its life-saving antiretroviral drugs, officials said. Let's move now to Ukraine, and a story that is equal parts grim and grimly ironic. Ukraine launched its largest-scale drone attack on Moscow this week. By the Russian government's own count, nearly 1,000 Ukrainian drones were shot down across the country on Thursday. But one of the most dramatic images from the attack, the spectacular explosion of a fuel storage facility in Moscow, its roof launching into the air on a column of black smoke, may not have been caused by a Ukrainian drone at all. The Times' visual investigations team analyzed social media videos and found strong evidence that a Russian air defense missile may have hit the fuel silo itself. One video, originally shared on Chinese social media, shows what appears to be a missile fired from the ground traveling on a low trajectory toward the silo, which explodes around the time of the missile's arrival. Several other videos show uniformed men on a Moscow area road firing manpad missiles, portable shoulder-fired weapons, in an attempt to take down Ukrainian drones flying overhead. A British security expert who reviewed the footage said it strongly supports the supposition that this is a manpad launch. A professor of defense aeronautics said that firing these weapons at low altitude in an urban environment was an indication of the desperation of the situation, possibly in this case with unintended consequences. The Kremlin said air defense systems are performing at a high level despite everything. Russia bolstered its defenses around the affected area by Friday. Ukraine has been ramping up long-range drone production in recent months, enabling attacks on Russian oil and fuel facilities that have caused fuel lines and rationing at Russian gas stations, but still lacks the ballistic missiles Russia regularly fires at Ukrainian cities. Now for a story that broke many hearts this week, and one that captured something about joy and tragedy existing in the same moment that felt almost too much to bear. Marie Marseille is 44 years old. She grew up in Rockland County, New York, in a family of die-hard Knicks fans. She now lives in Los Angeles, works as a nurse, and is studying for a master's degree in public health. Her brother is 6'8", played professional basketball in Malta and Turkey, and now works in security for the Knicks. Marseille is so anxious about big games that she can't watch them. So on Saturday night, as the Knicks played with the championship one win away, she distracted herself at home, cleaned her apartment, watched a Lifetime movie, took her 2-year-old golden Saint Berdoodle, Jameson, who was wearing his blue and orange Knicks shirt, for a walk. She checked the score online occasionally. Her son texted updates. Then her mother called from New York. Game over. Knicks win. Oh my God, she screamed. I can't believe this. Ah. Oh my God. I can't believe this, the Knicks won. A neighbor heard the commotion and reported a possible domestic disturbance, apparently mistaking her outburst for a cry for help. 2 LAPD officers responded. As Marseille tried to step into the hallway to speak with them, Jameson slipped out. She heard 2 gunshots. An officer's gun was pointed at Jameson. A shell casing hit her foot. The smell of gunpowder filled the air. Jameson was on the ground, still alive, his Knicks shirt bloodied. She ran over and draped herself over him. Jamo, she called. Jamo. Jamo. I watched him take his last breath, she told the Times. The LAPD says that as officers spoke with Marseille, the dog was barking, they asked her to secure him, and then the dog charged at an officer. The LAPD issued a use of force policy for hostile dog encounters in 2023 that lists 7 tactics and tools officers can use before firing their weapon: voice commands, chemical spray, baton, fire extinguisher, taser, a beanbag shotgun, and kicking. A video of Marseille on the ground, leaning over Jameson's body, went viral. She heard from people across the country and around the world. A GoFundMe raised more than $170,000. Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass promised a thorough and transparent investigation. The LAPD chief promised a full review. She and her son, Jeremiah Garcia, had waited their whole lives to see the Knicks win a championship. They had about half an hour between the buzzer sounding in San Antonio and the knock on her door to experience pure elation. Now, she says, she cannot enjoy the title without thinking about Jameson. From coast to coast, the storm. Tropical Storm Arthur, the first named storm of the 2026 hurricane season, has drenched a swath of the southeast from Texas to the Carolinas. At least 3 people have died. A 53-year-old woman died after her car was swept off the road by rushing waters near San Antonio. A 15-year-old boy drowned in a flooded retention pond north of Houston. A man helping clean up storm debris in Mississippi was also killed. Some of the highest rainfall totals were reported in central Louisiana. One community received 29 inches of rain. Another received 22.5 inches. That is nearly 2 feet of rain. Emergency officials in Mississippi are warning that heavy rains may continue, with wind gusts also causing damage. And it is brutally hot on top of it all. Forecasters are warning that the heat index will break triple digits in many places across Louisiana. The storm came ashore in Texas Wednesday, weekend, and moved northeast through the southeast. The ground is already saturated, so any additional rain turns directly into runoff pouring into already swollen rivers and streams. Meteorologists say the unusual thing about Arthur is how long it has been sitting in the south, producing repeated rounds of rainfall, rather than moving through quickly. The threat of flash flooding was expected to continue into Saturday. Let's turn to culture. It's a rich week for things to watch, read, and listen to. House of the Dragon returns to HBO for its 3rd season on June 21st, that's tomorrow, and The Times sat down with its star, Matt Smith, in the garden of his London home to talk about how a former doctor who turned himself into one of television's most compelling villains. Smith, who plays Daemon Targaryen, a silver-haired, dragon-riding prince who kills with ease and unconcern, has made something of a career out of taking his natural likability and weaponizing it in service of dark, complicated men. After his beloved run as the Doctor on Doctor Who, he starred in the stage adaptation of American Psycho. He played a young Prince Philip on The Crown. He played a murderous character in the macabre thriller Lost River. And now, 6 seasons into Game of Thrones' prequel universe, blood spatter, as the Times puts it, looks great on him. What makes Smith particularly interesting to watch and to read about is how he approaches these roles. He doesn't become them in some total method acting transformation. He fights their corner. He finds what's wounded in them, what's human. We need our villains, he told the Times. And when you watch him, even when Demon is at his most brutal, you find yourself caring. The showrunner Ryan Condal had Smith's picture on the writer's room wall as Demon inspiration before ever casting him. His co-star Emma Darcy called him the custodian of an ancient knowledge. Stephen Moffat, who created Smith's Doctor Who and has known him for 2 decades, described his social charm this way: everyone that Matt ever talks to thinks that they are probably Matt's best friend. Nah, you just got Matt Smithied. Season 3 begins tomorrow on HBO. And at the movies right now, Toy Story 5 is in theaters, and this time, Jessie the Cowgirl doll is in charge. Joan Cusack, who has voiced Jessie for 27 years across 4 movies, specials, video games, and theme park rides, talked to the Times about the character, the franchise, and her life since leaving Hollywood to open a gift shop in Chicago. One detail worth knowing before you see the film: Jessie was not always going to be a cowgirl doll. Early in the development of Toy Story 2, she was envisioned as a talking cactus, a sidekick called Señorita Cactus. Cusack didn't know that until the Times told her. "Oh, wow, I didn't know that," she said. Also on the cultural radar, The Death of Robin Hood, written and directed by Michael Sarnowski, is now in theaters. It stars Hugh Jackman, stripped of all his natural buoyancy, to great grizzled effect, the Times' critic writes, as a version of Robin Hood who was not the noble outlaw of legend, but possibly a marauding killer whose heroic mythology was invented from whole cloth. Jodie Comer, Bill Skarsgård, and Noah Jupe co-star. It's rated R for what the Times describes as remarkably graphic violence and medieval forms of medicine, which can be pretty gross. The critic calls it more intellectually satisfying to think about than to watch, but says it works best as an exploration of how stories are manufactured, handed across generations, and used to determine who we think the heroes are. In sad news from the entertainment world, James Burrows has died at the age of 85. If you don't recognize the name, you almost certainly recognize his work. Burrows was the director who helped create Cheers and directed all but 35 of its 275 episodes. He also directed Taxi, The Mary Tyler Moore Show, Frasier, Friends, Will and Grace, The Big Bang Theory, and more than 1,000 other sitcom episodes across his career. He directed 75 pilot episodes that became series. He was, as the Times once put it, the man whose visual style and comedic instincts have helped create more comedy hits than anyone else in television. Before the Friends pilot aired in 1994, Burrows gathered the 6 young, mostly unknown cast members, Kudrow, Cox, LeBlanc, Schwimmer, Perry, and Aniston, flew them to Las Vegas, and had dinner at Spago. He wanted them to bond before the world met them. At dinner, he told them, "This is your last shot at anonymity. Once the show comes on the air, you guys will never be able to go anywhere without being hounded." He was right. And he knew television better than almost anyone who has ever worked in it. James Burrows was 85 years old. On the music side, Popcast, the Times' pop music podcast, has released its semi-annual mailbag episode, a fan-favorite format where hosts John Caramanica and Joe Coscarelli tackle listener questions. This round, is the band Geese the Joe Biden of rock? Was Maroon 5 a pop-rap gateway drug? What band had the most transformative decade-long album run? Do people think Adele is lazy? And can a Swiftie and a Twizzy ever truly understand each other? Worth a listen. Also, Grammy-winning Icelandic vocalist Laufey has written an essay for the Times about dissonance, not just in music, but as a driving force in her life. She writes about learning that the harmonies she had devoted herself to in classical training were actually an intricate interplay between harmony and dissonance, and how that realization unlocked something for her. She quotes the composer Arnold Schoenberg, who argued that dissonance was not a flaw to be resolved but a liberation, the freeing of music from the condition of needing to exist in perfect harmony. Laufey applies that idea to her decision to leave Iceland for Boston, to separate from her twin sister, to break the rules of classical training that had once seemed indestructible. "I no longer live with the need to exist in perfect harmony," she writes. "Dissonance has finally set me free. And a quick safety update: a judge in Los Angeles has issued a 5-year restraining order against a man who tried to enter pop star Sabrina Carpenter's home more than a dozen times. The man argued in court records that he and Carpenter were at center focus of a classified military government program that made it essential that they'd be together as soon as possible for national and global security. Carpenter described him as a complete stranger and said his delusional insistence that he knows me and was expected by me is indicative of a dangerous, delusional, and irrational fixation. The order requires the man to stay away from Carpenter, her sister, and her sister's partner for 5 years. A brief dispatch from the world of art: American artist James Torrell has just opened his 100th skyspace installation, his most ambitious yet, at the Aarhus Museum in Aarhus, Denmark. Called As Seen Below the Dome, it is the largest skyspace in a museum setting. Visitors travel through a curving underground passage into a circular chamber capped by a dome about 130 feet in diameter, with an opening at the top that frames the sky. More than 1,100 hidden lights combine with natural light and the physics of the human eye to create an experience that plays with perception in ways that have reportedly moved multiple visitors to simply lie down on the floor and stare upward. The work took 12 years to complete, faced an enormous permit process, required engineering techniques never used at this scale, and was delayed by a year when the company supplying the retractable lid went bankrupt in 2025. The King and Queen of Denmark were scheduled to attend the inauguration. Torrell himself, unfortunately, is recovering from treatment for melanoma and had to stay home. As he noted, melanoma comes from too much exposure to shortwave UV light. I got too much of a good thing. And in Athens, the Parthenon's western facade has been restored for the first time in more than 220 years. Marble slabs have been added to fill gaps in the western pediment, the triangular section at the top of the columns that had been empty since Lord Elgin, a British aristocrat who served as ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, removed sculptures from the temple around 1800. Those sculptures, known as the Elgin marbles, were sold to the British government and are now in the British Museum. Britain and Greece have been in talks since 2021 about potentially returning them. The restoration, which began in 2017, now shows the Parthenon's western facade in what the Greek Ministry of Culture calls its most complete form possible for the first time in about 220 years. Some quick items from the living section that caught our attention. A black market has emerged for retatrutide, described as the most powerful weight loss drug in development. The drug, made by Eli Lilly, is not expected to hit the US market before next year, but people are already buying what they believe to be the drug from WhatsApp groups, Telegram channels, websites, and Chinese labs. Vials arrive labeled for research purposes only. Roughly 15 pounds of the substance, potentially hundreds of thousands of doses, flowed into the country between January and April of this year. The FDA has warned that black market products claiming to contain retatrutide may be contaminated or contain entirely different substances. The Times reports that 40 people have reported adverse reactions since 2024, including cardiac issues, 14 hospitalizations, and 4 life-threatening responses. The bottom line from experts: without rigorous testing, buyers have essentially no way to know what they're actually injecting. Also in health, researchers are increasingly finding that fathers experience postpartum depression too. An estimated 10% of fathers develop symptoms like depression and anxiety during the perinatal period, from pregnancy through the first year after birth. The riskiest window for men, researchers say, is 3 to 6 months after babies are born, possibly related to the growing demands of an active infant or to the mother returning to work. Men's symptoms often look different. Depression may manifest as irritability, anger, or physical symptoms like muscle tension, rather than sadness. Men are also considered more likely to mask symptoms with alcohol, drugs, or gambling. And the number one risk factor for paternal postpartum depression? Maternal postpartum depression. The conditions are connected. Finally, the World Cup. We are 1 week in, and the United States national team is looking very good. The Americans beat Australia 2-0 in a feisty, physical game before a rowdy crowd in Seattle on Friday. This is the first time since 1930 that the United States has started a World Cup with 2 wins. They are now assured a spot in the knockout rounds. And American fans, who have been cautiously optimistic throughout, are starting to ask a question they haven't felt comfortable asking in a long time: could this team actually do it? Other results from Friday: Morocco all but sealed its place in the knockout rounds with a 1-0 win over Scotland. Brazil earned its first win of the tournament with a 3-0 trouncing of Haiti. And the early expert takes from The Athletic after the first round of group play: France is the most impressive team so far, winning 3-1 against a powerful Senegal even when not playing their best. Ghana has been the most disappointing, unable to score against Panama except from 3 yards in front of an open goal. The best individual player after one round, still Messi, who reminded the world exactly who he is with a hat-trick against Algeria. And as for who is going to win it all, one expert says Spain, logic unaltered by 1 week of results. Another says England. It's coming home. Apparently. And that brings us to the end of today's briefing. Thank you so much for spending part of your weekend with us. There is a lot happening in the world right now, diplomacy that is fraying at the edges, policy that will affect millions of lives, a city rediscovering its capacity for joy, and a championship 53 years in the making. Whatever you take from today, I hope you carry some of that New York feeling with you, that sense that the person next to you in the elevator might be worth talking to. Have a great Saturday. We'll be back tomorrow.